What kills a king? History often tells of knives in the dark, poisoned cups, and stray arrows in battle. But for the young king we are about to discuss, the murderer did not come from outside. It was not a hidden enemy or a political conspiracy. His greatest enemy, the one who sealed his tragic fate from the moment he was conceived, was the very thing that ran through his veins every day. It was his royal blood, the blood that was supposed to be divine, his greatest legacy. But in reality, it was a genetic death sentence, a curse forged through generations by an arrogant and misguided belief. The story of Tutankhamun is not the story of a dynasty, but of a biological tragedy disguised as a golden veneer of divinity. The 18th dynasty of Egypt, one of the most glorious and powerful dynasties, was built on a unique ideological foundation. They were not simply rulers protected by the gods. They saw themselves as direct descendants of the gods. In their minds, the pharaoh was not a mortal, but a living god, a living link between the human world and the divine realm. This belief shaped every aspect of royal life, and most importantly, it governed their marriage rules. If your blood was divine, how could you let it be tainted by the blood of a mortal? Their answer was clear and absolute. Only gods could marry gods, and so a deadly tradition was born. The royal river, instead of flowing forward and joining new streams to become stronger, folded back on itself, forming a vicious circle. It became a stagnant swamp where water could not circulate, where life slowly withered in its own suffocation. Inbreeding became a sacred duty. Brother married sister to reenact the mythical marriage of Osiris and Isis. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, all in the name of preserving divine purity. They did not realize that, in their efforts to preserve the blood of the gods, they were destroying the biological foundation of their own humanity. Each inbreeding was another time they added poison to the family's genetic swamp. Faulty genes, carrying potential diseases, instead of being diluted and disappearing, have the opportunity to multiply, combine, and create increasingly weak, sick, and deformed generations. The climax of this tragedy was the generation of Tutankhamun's parents. His father, Pharaoh Akhenaten, was a contradictory figure. He was a great religious reformer who dared to challenge a 1,000-year-old belief system, but he was an absolute conservative when it came to bloodlines. To find an heir, he turned to his own sister, a woman whose identity would later have to be confirmed by DNA, known as the Younger Lady. She was a ghost in royal records, her name and image erased, her existence erased. Perhaps the fact that she gave birth to a child with many disabilities made her a disgrace, living proof that the miracle of divine blood had failed. Her erasure was the court's way of trying to cover up the fact that their genetic swamp had finally produced a diseased flower, and that flower was Tutankhamun. He was born not with a silver spoon, but with a long line of genetic defects. His body was a mosaic of biological errors that had accumulated over generations. From the moment he was born, he was destined for a short and painful life. The curse his ancestors had created, in the name of purity, had finally crystallized in the form of their son. He was the ultimate product of a false ideology, the ultimate proof that when a dynasty considers itself divine and defies the laws of nature, its downfall is inevitable. Tutankhamun's life, therefore, was written before he even breathed the first breath of Egyptian air. And so, the boy took a deep breath of the Egyptian air. But instead of a healthy cry that echoed through the palace, Tutankhamun's birth was probably shrouded in an uneasy silence. For when the attendants and midwives looked upon the tiny form of the prince, they did not see a god descending from heaven. They saw a living testament to the royal curse. From the very first day, Tutankhamun's body had been a verdict. The curse that had been forged in the genetic swamp of his ancestors had now blossomed, and its petals bore the thorns of disease. He grew up unlike other royal children. While princes were trained to be warriors, leaders, and hunters, Tutankhamun's childhood was a struggle to survive. He could not run through the vast halls of the Theban palace. The training ground was not a place for him to practice with swords, but a place where he struggled with every step. His left foot was the most obvious congenital deformity, twisted, and shrunken. Each step he took was not a step forward, but an effort to maintain his balance, dragging a part of his body that refused to obey. The cold marble of the palace floor must have been accustomed to the scraping sound of his feet, a sound out of place in the solemnity of the palace. But that was only the beginning. His spine was not straight like a reed on the banks of the Nile, but crooked, causing his shoulders to constantly slump forward. His hips were deformed, his teeth were crooked, and his skull was abnormally long. Inside his body, an invisible enemy was gnawing. Modern scientists believe he suffered from a form of osteonecrosis, possibly Kohler's disease, which caused the bone tissue in his legs to die from lack of blood flow. This left his bones brittle, weak, and extremely painful. Every movement, every standing up or sitting down, could be torture. In a world that worshipped strength and physical perfection like ancient Egypt, a disabled prince was unthinkable, a dangerous contradiction. So an elaborate drama was staged around him. The court, from priests to officials to servants, became actors in the play. His pain was interpreted as a test of the gods. His weakness was called a sign of the chosen pure. Courtiers were trained to look away whenever he stumbled, to pretend not to hear him gasp for breath after a short walk. Silence became an unwritten rule. Meanwhile, the royal artisans were given a crucial task: to create a false version of Tutankhamun. On tomb walls, bas-reliefs, and ceremonial objects, the image of him was perfect. A well-proportioned, symmetrical-faced young pharaoh stood proudly, arching a bow or riding a chariot. These images were not reflections, but distortions of reality, propaganda attempts to hide a shameful reality. They carved a god while hiding a disabled child. The more than 130 walking sticks found in his tomb were the most eloquent evidence of this deception. They were not just luxurious, intricately carved ceremonial accessories. Many of them showed signs of wear from constant use. They were essential medical supplies, silent companions that supported his aching body every day. Imagine a boy of only 10 or 12 years old, having to lean on a log to move around his own home, while everyone around him bowed and called him a living god. The loneliness in such a situation must have been immeasurable. They even changed his name. He was born to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Aten, in keeping with his father's monotheistic beliefs. But when Akhenaten died and the court wanted to return to the old gods to appease the clergy, they renamed him Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. It was a shrewd political move, but also ironic. They could change the god in his name, but they couldn't change the flaws in his body. They could restore the old temples, but they couldn't rebuild the rotting bones of the young king. Thus Tutankhamun's childhood passed, in a prison of lies and physical pain. He was a secret hidden from all eyes, a broken prince whom an empire was trying to patch up with gold and lies. They had succeeded in creating an illusion, a perfect cover. But now they were about to face a much greater challenge, transforming this boy who could not stand on his own 2 feet into the most powerful pharaoh in the world, placing on his hunched shoulders the weight of both Upper and Lower Egypt. And then the fateful day came. When Tutankhamun was only 9 years old, a child who should have been learning to read and write and play, an entire empire decided that he should become a god. The coronation ceremony was held in Thebes, in the great temple of Karnak, under the huge columns that rose like the trunks of a stone forest. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the ancient hymns sung by the priests. The boy was draped in fine linen and heavy gold ornaments. They placed on his head the double crown of the skint, the symbol of the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. Its weight must have strained his weak neck, and the glitter of gold and precious stones must have dazzled him. There he sat, on the throne of the gods, his tiny feet not touching the ground, his deformed left foot hidden by a cloth. He looked down at the sea of bowing heads, the elders, the weather-beaten generals, all chanting his name. Tutankhamun, the living god, lord of the 2 lands. But in the wide eyes of that 9-year-old boy, perhaps, there was not the pride of a king, but the bewilderment and fear of an unwilling actor thrust onto a stage too grand. He was given the crooked staff and the flail, symbols of supreme power, but they were heavier than his arms could hold. From that moment on, Tutankhamun became pharaoh, but he never truly ruled. He was just a puppet on a golden throne. True power lay not with the boy on the throne, but with the men in the shadows. The 2 greatest shadows cast over Tutankhamun's short reign were Ai and Hormheb. Ai, the vizier, was a seasoned politician, a cunning courtier. He had served since Tut's father, had witnessed Akhenaten's religious revolution, and had survived the chaos that followed. Now he played the role of wise old advisor, the young king's mentor. He was the brains behind every decision, the man who drafted the decrees that Tutankhamun had only to stamp with his stamp of approval. His voice was soft, but his will was iron. He trained the young king in etiquette, in smiling, in nodding, but never in making decisions for himself. If I was the political brain, Horemheb was the sword of the empire. As commander-in-chief, he controlled the military. He was a tough, ambitious warrior who understood that true power came from the army, not from temple rituals. He led campaigns in Syria and Nubia, negotiating with foreign envoys, all in the name of the pharaoh. After each victory, he would bow to the young king, a show of respect, but both knew implicitly who was in real command. Tutankhamun was the nominal commander-in-chief, but he had probably never held a real sword. His life became a series of scripted performances. Each day was a whirlwind of rituals. He was awakened, bathed, dressed, anointed like a living statue. He presided over ceremonies whose meaning he did not fully understand, reciting prayers written by the priests. At council meetings, he sat silently, listening to men twice, 3 times his age debate taxes, irrigation, and foreign threats. Occasionally they would turn to him, not for advice, but for a blessing, a divine endorsement of decisions they had made on their own. The greatest political task of his reign, the reversal of his father's religious revolution, was also a clear demonstration of his role as a puppet. Under ice, guidance, and pressure from the Ammonius clergy, Tutankhamun issued the Stele of Restoration. This decree renounced the Aten, restoring the supremacy of Ammonius and other traditional gods. Closed temples were reopened and great wealth was bestowed. The capital was moved from Amarna to Thebes. On paper, this was the act of a wise king correcting the mistakes of his predecessor and bringing harmony to the country. But in reality, it was a counterattack by the conservatives, by the old elites who had lost power under Akhenaten. They used the boy on the throne as a legitimate tool to carry out their overthrow. He was a lonely king, a prisoner in his own palace. He was surrounded by luxury, but lacking in sincerity. He was worshipped as a god, but treated as a child. They needed his blood to legitimize their power, needed his image to reassure the people, but they did not need his intellect or his will. They controlled his every political decision, his every religious ritual. But there was one duty that no official or general could perform for him, a duty most sacred and personal, to preserve his lineage. And it was here, in the royal bedchamber, that Tutankhamun's tragedy would take on a new chapter, one more painful and personal than any decree he had ever signed. The court controlled the throne, the army, and the temples. But there was one area where their power did not extend, the royal bedchamber, where a king's ultimate and biological duty was to produce an heir. This was not a matter of love or choice. For Tutankhamun, it was a duty imposed by the bloodline that had created him. And the person chosen to carry out this duty with him was none other than his half-sister Enkhesenamun. Their marriage was probably a quiet affair, a carefully planned affair rather than a romantic affair. The boy was barely 10, the bride a girl of 14. The two children, products of the same genetic vortex, were bound together by the thread of duty. They were the living embodiments of the myth of Osiris and Isis, but in reality, they were prisoners in a gilded cage. Perhaps the only two people in all Egypt who truly understood each other's loneliness. Enkhesenamun, more than any other courtier or priest, had witnessed her husband's pain firsthand. She had seen him stumble when no one was looking, heard him groan in the night, and perhaps it was she who had soothed his aching joints. On the tomb walls and burial objects, artists painted an idol of royal love. Queen Enkhesenamun tenderly anoints her husband, and they exchange white lotus flowers, a symbol of rebirth. There are also scenes of them hunting together, but there is always a subtle detail. Tutankhamun is often depicted sitting on a chair, even as he draws his bow, an oblique acknowledgement of his physical condition. It was a stage performance for posterity, a state-sponsored love story meant to affirm the harmony and fertility of the divine couple. But behind these idealized images, the truth was far more brutal. Their mission was to produce a successor pharaoh. And they tried, not once, but twice. But the curse of blood did not let up. Each time hope was raised in the palace, it was tragically crushed. Tutankhamun became pregnant twice, and both times ended in despair. Their two daughters, the only two princesses in Egypt at the time, were stillborn. When Howard Carter excavated Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, one of the most heartbreaking discoveries was not gold or silver, but two miniature coffins, placed modestly inside a wooden chest. Inside, wrapped in linen, were the mummified bodies of two infants. One girl, born around the 5th month of gestation, was tiny and frail. The other girl was larger, perhaps close to her due date. Later scientific analysis painted an even more tragic picture. Both children had suffered severe birth defects, including scoliosis and skeletal deformities, familiar signs of the genetic curse that had afflicted their father. This was not just the grief of a young couple losing their child. It was a disaster for the dynasty. The royal line, already fragile after generations of inbreeding, had come to a dead end. Tutankhamun was the last branch, and that branch failed to sprout. The cries of a newborn baby did not ring out in the palace. Instead, there was a heavy silence of defeat. The pressure on the young king's shoulders must have been doubled. He had failed in the most basic of pharaoh duties. For Tutankhamun, this pain must have left a scar that never healed. She had seen her father, her mother, and now both of her children fall victim to the same tradition. After these tragedies, her image seems to have faded from royal records. Her absence may have been a sign of her grief and withdrawal from public life. The palace may have attempted to cover up. The priests may have blamed it on curses from enemies or performed more rituals to invoke the gods' blessings. But no ritual could change the biological truth. The divine bloodline had become too weak to sustain itself. It had become its own poison. This failure to reproduce drove the final nail into the coffin of the illusion of royal superiority. The lineage had come to a dead end. The last hope had been buried with the two little babies in their tiny coffins. Now Tutankhamun was left alone, his body betraying him, and his greatest enemy was no longer the pressure of the court, but his own dying cells, his own bones rotting from within. The royal line had come to a dead end. The last hope of an heir had been buried along with the two young children. Now Tutankhamun was all alone, caught between the pressures of an empire and the betrayal of his own body. The mental anguish of failing to continue his lineage must have been a terrible psychological burden, and it added fuel to the fire that was slowly burning him from within. For an already fragile body, this extreme stress was the final push that pushed him to the brink of collapse. His greatest enemy was no longer the machinations of the court, but the dying cells and rotting bones within him. The final years of adolescence, the period when a young man should be at the peak of his physical strength, were a steep decline for Tutankhamun. The chronic pain he had lived with since childhood turned into acute, excruciating, unbearable pain. He walked more slowly, and there were days when he could not walk at all. The magnificent palace became a hospital, and his bedroom a sick room. Ceremonies were shortened. Council meetings were moved to his bedside. The court claimed that the pharaoh was in a period of divine meditation to connect more deeply with the gods. But the truth was, their living god was dying. And then, an accident, perhaps inevitable for someone with such weak legs, happened. Perhaps in a moment of trying to stand up too quickly, or a misstep on the slippery stone floor, he fell. A dry, sharp crack sounded from his left leg. Severe pain tore through the regal silence. Later CT scans showed a severe fracture in the femur just above the knee. It was an open fracture. The bone had punctured the flesh, a door wide open for bacteria to invade. For a healthy body, this would have been a serious injury. For Tutankhamun, with his immune system already compromised by genetics, it was a death sentence. The wound would not heal. It swelled, festered, and became severely infected. Fever began to come in waves, like the raging waves of the Nile in flood season. There were times when he shivered beneath his many layers of bedding, his teeth chattering. There were other times when he burned like an oven, his skin dry and cracked, delirious with heat. Sepsis had begun to spread throughout his body, poisoning his royal blood. As if a broken leg and sepsis weren't enough, another invisible enemy, already lurking in his body, took the opportunity to resurface. Modern DNA testing detected the presence of the Plasmodium falciparum parasite, which causes the most severe form of malaria. His immune system, already struggling with the injury and infection, was now completely overwhelmed. It was a perfect storm of medical disasters, a serious injury, a systemic infection, and a flare-up of malaria. Tutankhamun's broken body had no strength left to fight back. Still, the act had to go on. Even when he couldn't stand, they propped him up in a chair, painted his gaunt face, tied a gold necklace around his thin neck. On the worst days, when he was too weak to sit, they lifted him into a palanquin and carried him out onto the balcony so the people could see their king, even if only as a faint, motionless silhouette. They needed him to be seen, needed the illusion of a pharaoh still in power to keep the empire from falling into chaos. In his feverish delirium, Tutankhamun's world may have merged with the real. He may have seen again the face of his father, Akhenaten, and his abandoned city of the sun. He may have called out to his dead daughters, the infants he would soon join in the afterlife. He may have whispered prayers to the gods, but received only silence. He was the son of Ra, the living Horus, but no god had come to save him. His solitude was absolute. He was dying, surrounded by people, but utterly alone. His cursed royal body, after 18 or 19 years of relentless struggle, had finally reached its limit. It had given up. In the cold chamber, between layers of sweat-soaked linen, the last breath of the living god had faded gently into the air. And as the first dawn of a new day without Tutankhamun rose over the Valley of the Kings, the deathly silence in the pharaoh's bedchamber signaled something more terrifying than the death of a king. A succession crisis and a power struggle were about to begin. Dawn broke over the Valley of the Kings, but in the palace of Thebes, a different kind of darkness was gathering. The silence in the pharaoh's bedchamber was not peace, but the bells of a political storm. When the young king's cold body was discovered by his terrified attendants, the news was not delivered with funeral trumpets, but with urgent whispers in the hidden corridors. There was no loud wailing of a kingdom bereft of its king. Instead, there was the tense silence of a power struggle just begun. Ai and Hormheb, the two most powerful men in the empire, were summoned immediately. This was not the time to mourn. This was the time to seize the vacant throne. As political intrigues began to unfold, Tutankhamun's body was taken to the Wabit, the House of Purification, to begin the 70-day embalming process. But even during this final sacred ritual, tragedy continued to follow him. The embalmers faced a nearly impossible task. The young king's body, already ravaged by disease, fever, and infection, began to decompose at an alarming rate. In their panic, and perhaps under pressure to get the job done quickly, they made some serious mistakes. Instead of preserving the body, they almost destroyed it. They used an unusually large amount of black pine resin and embalming oils. When heated and poured over the body, the mixture caused a violent chemical reaction. It cooked the remaining flesh, blackened and brittled the bones, and cemented Tutankhamun's body to the bottom of his solid gold coffin. The perfect encasement they had sought to create in death was in fact a crematorium that destroyed what remained of the young king. The most mysterious and haunting thing was that his heart was missing. For the ancient Egyptians, the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory, the thing that would be weighed on the scales of justice in the afterlife. By procedure, the heart was always left in the body, but Tutankhamun's chest was empty. His sternum and part of his ribs had been removed. Why? Had the heart become so rotten that it could not be saved? Or had it been deliberately removed in a final, desperate ritual? Or was it a final act of erasure of his identity, a silent insult? The secret was sealed with him. A king without a heart, an empty chest. That was the last image of Tutankhamun before he was obscured by the golden mask. In parallel with the disastrous mummification, another race was underway, preparing the tomb. The great tomb that Tutankhamun was to have, a work worthy of a pharaoh, was still a half-finished project. There was no time. So the court settled on a much smaller tomb, perhaps intended for some high official, not a king. It was too small, too humble. The haste is evident in every detail. The murals on the walls are sloppy, the brush strokes rushed, the colors uneven. Researchers have found that the paint was not even dry when the tomb was sealed, as evidenced by the mold that has grown on the walls over the millennia. To compensate for the lack of space and the haste with which they prepared, they did one thing. They filled the tomb with an enormous amount of treasure. More than 5,000 items. Throne, bed, chariot, statue, canopic jar, jewelry. all gold or gilded. On the surface, it was the ultimate tribute, but in context, it seemed like an act of guilt, a desperate attempt to use the glitter of gold to obscure an embarrassing truth. They buried him with more than 130 walking sticks, silent reminders of his disability. They buried the chariots he would probably never be able to drive. And most poignantly, they placed 2 small coffins containing the bodies of his 2 stillborn daughters, sealing the entire family tragedy into one cramped vault. Finally, when everything was packed inside, I, as the highest official, performed the opening of the mouth ceremony on Tutankhamun's mummy. He used ceremonial tools to touch the dead king's mouth, eyes, and nose so that he could speak, see, and breathe in the afterlife. An ironic gesture from the man who was about to take his throne. Then the builders placed the final stone, sealing the entrance. The court must have breathed a sigh of relief. The problem of the broken king was finally solved. He was buried. They had buried his body. Now they began to bury his name. A deliberate silence began to fall over Tutankhamun's short reign, a silence that would last for millennia. They had buried his body. Now they began to bury his name. Once the stone doors of KV-62 were sealed, another campaign, quieter but more ruthless, was launched. It was a systematic erasure of memory, an attempt to erase Tutankhamun and an entire awkward chapter from the grand annals of Egypt. A deliberate silence began to hang over his short reign, a silence that would last for millennia. It all began shortly after Tutankhamun's death. Vizier I, who had orchestrated the funeral, made a bold political move to seize the throne. He married Tutankhamun's widow, Enkhesenamun, his grieving wife and sister. The marriage was not for love, but rather as a way to legitimize his power, so that I could assume the mantle of royalty himself. But I's reign was a brief one, lasting no more than 4 years. It was after his death that true power emerged. General Hormheb, who had waited patiently in the shadows, finally stepped into the light and seized the crown. Hormheb had no royal blood, so he needed to consolidate his power by rewriting history. He launched a Damnatio Memoriae campaign against the entire Amarna period. This was a period considered a stain, a time of heresy under Akhenaten. In order to restore order and establish himself as the rightful successor to the great pharaohs who had come before him, Hormheb had to erase everything related to Akhenaten. And in this purge, Tutankhamun, as Akhenaten's direct son and successor, became an inevitable victim. He was part of the story that Hormheb wanted all of Egypt to forget. The obliteration was on all fronts. Hormheb ordered his stonemasons to travel across the country, searching for the monuments and stele erected during the reign of Tutankhamun. There, they painstakingly chiseled away Tutankhamun's cartouche and carved Hormheb's name on top. The Renaissance stele, the greatest recorded achievement of Tutankhamun's reign, was appropriated by Hormheb as his own. It was identity theft on a national scale. Future generations would look at these monuments and believe that it was Hormheb who restored the temples and brought prosperity. More importantly, in later official king lists, such as the famous Abydos king list under Seti I, royal historians made a huge leap in time. They went straight from Pharaoh Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun's grandfather, to Hormheb. 4 pharaohs, Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and I, were completely erased. To the official history, they never existed. They were torn out chapters, taboo names. Oblivion gradually set in. Because Tutankhamun's reign was so short, and he did not build the centuries-old structures that other great kings did, there was little for posterity to remember him by. His few accomplishments were usurped by others. He had no great battles, no heroic tales. He simply faded into the past. And then, a historical accident sealed the oblivion perfectly. A few generations later, when workers were building the tomb of Pharaoh Ramesses VI directly above, they dumped tons of earth and rubble into the entrance to Tutankhamun's tiny tomb. The move was probably unintentional, but it effectively hid the tomb, erasing it from the map of the Valley of the Kings. This inadvertence proved to be the best defense. While tomb robbers ravaged the valley, breaking and looting nearly every other royal tomb for 3,000 years, the tomb of the forgotten king remained, miraculously intact. He was protected not by a curse, but by his own anonymity. 3 millennia passed, an unimaginably long time. The gods of Egypt were replaced by the gods of Greece, then Rome, then the gods of Christianity and Islam. Hieroglyphics became a dead language. The great Egyptian empire was but a memory, and all the while, Tutankhamun slept. The sands of the desert finished the work the pharaohs had begun. Tutankhamun was gone. For more than 30 centuries, his name was silenced. Until one day, in November 1922, when a dry click sounded from underground, the faint sound of a pickaxe hitting a stone step, a sound that was about to awaken a sleeping legend. The sands of the desert had finished the work the pharaohs had begun. Tutankhamun was gone. For more than 30 centuries, his name had been silenced. Until one day, in November 1922, when a dry click sounded from underground, the faint sound of a pickaxe held by an Egyptian boy hitting a buried stone step, a sound that was about to awaken a sleeping legend. The man behind the search was British Egyptologist Howard Carter. He had spent years, almost his entire career, systematically digging in the Valley of the Kings, a place most experts believed was already depleted of treasure. Driven by an almost obsessive belief and funded by Lord Carnarvon, Carter refused to give up, and his persistence paid off. The stone steps led to a staircase, and the staircase led to a sealed passageway, still bearing the ancient seals of the royal tomb. The seals had not been broken. For 3,000 years, no tomb robber had ever entered. The excitement reached its peak. Carter had a small hole drilled in the upper corner of the door, and holding his breath, he put a candle inside to test for the poison gas. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the hot air escaping from the room made the candle flicker. What he saw stunned him. Gold furniture, strange ebony beasts, glittering statues were everywhere. When Lord Carnarvon impatiently asked, "Do you see anything?" Carter could only utter the immortal words, "Yes, wonderful things." The world went crazy. The discovery of a pharaoh's intact tomb was a global sensation. Newspapers reported it daily. Tutankhamun, the forgotten king, had been resurrected. But his resurrection created a new legend. He was remembered not as a man, but as a symbol of great wealth. The image of his golden mask became the face of ancient Egypt. He became the Golden Boy, King Tut, a name synonymous with curses, mystery, and splendor. The world fell in love with his treasure, but once again, they ignored the story of the boy inside. As Carter and his team carefully unwrapped each nested coffin, finally reaching the innermost 250-pound solid gold coffin, the moment of truth arrived. They lifted the lid, and the Golden Boy myth was shattered. Inside was not a sleeping god. It was a pile of rubble. The body was blackened and brittle, stuck to the bottom of the coffin by resin that had hardened like rock. The smell of rancid oil and rotting cloth filled the air. To remove the jewels and amulets, Carter's team was forced to take a step that would later be widely criticized. They dismembered the mummy. But from this destruction, another resurrection, a resurrection of truth, began. Over the decades, as science advanced, Tutankhamun's broken body began to tell its story. The first X-rays in 1968 revealed his age at death and some bone problems. But it wasn't until 2005, with the advent of CT scanning, that the full picture emerged. More than 1,700 3D images confirmed it all: clubbed feet, a curved spine, osteonecrosis in his feet, and a severe femur fracture that had become infected shortly before his death. The theory that he had been murdered by a blow to the head was dismissed. He wasn't killed by an enemy, he was killed by his own body. And in 2010, the final blow came from DNA testing. Science finally confirmed what historians had long suspected. His parents were Akhenaten and his biological sister. The DNA also found evidence of malaria parasites, proving that he had been battling multiple diseases at once. And perhaps most painfully, DNA from 2 children in the tomb confirmed that they were his, and that they too had genetic abnormalities. Science has done what the priests and pharaohs tried to prevent. It has given Tutankhamun a voice. His story is written not in gold or hymns, but in the genetic code, in the cracks in his bones, in the absence of his heart. Kings have tried to erase him from history. The modern world has tried to turn him into a flashy icon. But in the end, his shattered remains tell a story more real and tragic than any myth. The golden mask still looks back at us through protective glass, serene and eternal. But now we know the truth behind it. Not a god, but a lesson. A painful whisper from the past, a warning of what happens when an empire mistakes blood for divinity. And so the young king's story ends, but his legacy begins a new life, one he probably never imagined. The boy who lived and died in obscurity, hidden by the court, erased by his successors, and forgotten by time, is now the most famous pharaoh in history. There is a poetic irony in that. His existence, once considered a shame, a failure of his lineage, is now our most precious window into a lost era. Tutankhamun's fame does not come from what he did in life. He did not build the Great Pyramids. He did not conquer new lands. His legacy, paradoxically, comes from his own frailty and early death. It was his obscurity that protected his tomb from looters, leaving us with an untouched time capsule, a priceless glimpse into the opulence and complexity of the Egyptian royal world. But perhaps the most profound lesson that Tutankhamun left behind is not in the gold or the chariots. It lies in his tragic story. It is a reminder that behind the great myths, behind the symbols of power, there are always real people, with their own pains, desires, and tragedies. Tutankhamun was not the golden boy. He was a sick child, a puppet king, a broken husband and father. And when we look at that beautiful golden mask, perhaps we should take a moment to remember the broken boy who wore it.